We're in the full swing of our season 4. If you just found us, we have close to 40 episodes for you to explore. You don't need to listen to them in sequence. You can look them up and choose a la carte topics and issues that most interest you. I promise you will want to hear them all.
Facing such dire observations about the state of the field, is it even possible to establish equal relationships between the global north and global south? Is it possible to dismantle an industry that lives off the underdevelopment of others, whose bread and butter are the continuing international inequalities? Goal 2012 asked, over a decade ago, how a well-meaning Westerner can help the global south today. It begins, I believe, with some humility about the people in those places. It begins with some respect for the agency of the people of the global south.
Welcome to Dialogues. I'm Garry Aslanyan. This is a special series of the Global Health Matters podcast. In this series, I'll be blowing open some of the echo chambers that exist in global health. To help me in this quest, I've invited thoughtful and inquisitive individuals from different walks of life. Each of them has explored and written about global health issues from different disciplinary perspectives. I hope this dialogue series will give you, the listeners, an opportunity and space to step out of your daily routine and contemplate global health issues through a different lens. So let's get started. For this dialogue episode, I'm joined by Themrise Khan. Themrise is a Pakistani independent development professional and researcher with almost 30 years of experience in international development, aid effectiveness, gender, and global migration. Themrise is also the co-editor of the book, White Saviorism in International Development, Theories, Practices, and Lived Experiences. In this dialogue, Themrise will be sharing more of the origins of these concepts and how it continues to influence national autonomy, global power imbalances, and race relations. Hi, Themrise. How are you today?
Hi, Garry. I'm good. How are you?
Where do I find you?
You will find me today in Karachi, Pakistan.
I imagine it's quite hot. Let's kick off this conversation by you could give us an experience, an encounter you have had in your own country, in Pakistan, that has highlighted the inequities in power and privilege that exist in international development these days.
That's a tough question to answer, Garry, simply because there is not just one experience or encounter that I can share. There are so many, one doesn't even know where to start. I guess if you're talking about international development and power and privilege, one example I can give you is that for many years in my career as a independent development consultant in Pakistan, I used to be the quote unquote national consultant on several international teams of consultants who would come in from donor countries in the West to Pakistan to look at projects funded by these donors, etc. So I would be on those teams. And I would have to accompany these consultants, mostly white, Western, and mostly male, to a number of the project sites, which was they were small villages across in different parts of the country, and we would go visit projects like schools or health units or vocational centers, etc. And everybody was pre-prepared for these visits. The principal of the schools, for instance, had been told you are going to have foreign visitors coming in to look at your school. And when we would arrive, there would be a reception committee waiting with garlands of roses and flowers to shower rose petals on the foreign visitors, quote unquote. And they would be treated like royalty. And I myself, on the other hand, everybody would respect me very much so, but I would completely be sidelined in the excitement and in anticipation of these white foreigners coming in to a village.
Hmm.
And for me, that was always something that stood out, how my own people saw inequality, in the sense that I was one of their own technically. We were all Pakistanis. Um, but for them, I was still just one of their own, an ordinary person. It didn't matter. That white foreigner
Hmm.
who had all the money, who was coming in with the money to make sure, that everything was going well so they could continue getting the money, was the one who was feted like royalty. And that really struck out for me in terms of how international development as a profession has created this dynamic of, royalty versus the people.
Hmm. Hmm. And in recent years, we've had a lot of discourse on how to decolonize, or this term decolonization has been really debated. There were a lot of efforts and new approaches aimed at shifting power in development or in global health. Do you feel that progress is being made on that front?
Yes and no. There's a lot of recognition, and this includes global health and development, global health in particular since COVID, that there are inequalities, but it's all related to colonialism, hence decolonization.
Right.
To a certain extent, I absolutely agree with that. Colonialism has had a massive ongoing and continues to have a massive impact on the way we look at the world and look at each other. But we have also reached a point where a lot of countries have actually accurately decolonized, i.e., they have broken up away from colonial control and they're now independent states. So the idea of decolonizing and shifting power in global health and development isn't so much about colonialism, which is, I think, where the discourse and the approach is focused. It's more about who gets to decide. Is it the person who has all the money that gets to decide what happens where and how and when? Or is it the person on the other side who does need that money in most cases make that decision? And I
Mm.
think there has been no progress at all. We're still discussing, we're still at the point where we're trying to define what decolonization means in the context of global health or global development or what have you. And I think we need to go beyond those discussions into what is the actual reality of countries right now, politically, socially, economically. So, short answer, no, I don't think progress is being made.
Interesting, because we had an episode focused on the decolonization in global health, but also there was one of the most listened to episodes. So there is a lot of interest in this debate. So going with the terms and language really matters. You have recently written several pieces, and I've read at least one of them, highlighting the importance of the terms we use, and in this case, in distinction between countries or nations. How would you like to see our universal vocabulary change, and what impact could that have if we were to do that?
Definitely, I think language matters. And that too has been a very important part of the discourse. And ironically, the term decolonization is also about language, right? Because the term is an English term. And when I was doing some research on it, I tried to find a translation of the word decolonization in different languages. I couldn't find a single one. Arabic, I think, was the one that came closest to some sort of a word that was a literal translation, but there was actually no other. There was no word for decolonization in any other language, not in French, not in Spanish, not in Urdu, etc. So I think that itself was a huge finding. So yes, language does matter, but I think the whole idea is whose language are we talking about? And if we're talking about, like you said, a universal vocabulary, what is the universality of that vocabulary? So what we wrote about in that piece you mentioned was, what are the most appropriate terms to define who we all are? And who we all are very, very different. And one of our recommendations were that We all come from different regions. The global south isn't just the global south, and the global north isn't just the global north, because currently those are that's the terminology used
Hmm.
when it comes to development and health. But even the south is made up of continents. We're not even talking about regions, we're talking about continents. So why don't you let them decide how they want to be referred to? And I think that is the key. If we're talking about shifting power, all right, then ask countries how would they like to be referred. So that again shows you the power dynamics and how language also appropriates power.
Right, right. So if we keep with the terms, and one of the terms you chose to explore the great in more depth, it was this term white saviorism, and through the reading you just did, this led to publication of this anthology by you and several other co-authors titled White Saviorism in International Development: Theories, Practices, and Lived Experiences. Could you unpack for our listeners how you have come up to understand this term and the value inherent in it and the implications of using that term?
This is a term that I think has been around for a long time, but has never really been given any importance or prominence, particularly in international development. The way we saw the origins of this term was actually by an article written by Tehu Cole, a Nigerian American author,
Right.
who wrote a piece in The Atlantic in 2012 entitled The White Savior Industrial Complex. And that was a piece specifically about Africa and how basically white people had come, basically, how an entire industry had been formed around the idea of white people coming and saving those who are less fortunate
Hmm.
than them. And that is where the term the white savior industrial complex came up. It was earlier white saviorism. But again, very little spoken about it, written about it, discussed academically more so, but nobody actually brought it up in terms of how we practically approach and implement international development. And so this led us and my two other co-editors to think about exploring this in a little more detail. And because there was a lot of talk about racism and systemic inequalities, and like, okay, so what does white saviorism have to do with any of this?
Hmm.
Does it? And so that's how we came up with the topic and the theme of the book. And we had different iterations of it. We wanted to see how this developed in theory, how it actually developed in actual practice, and in people's lives worked in this sector. So that's where we came up. That was the concept of the book itself. And we saw white saviorism as a mental state of mind. That's how we defined it in the book
Right.
as well. That this is not something that is, it's not a tangible, applicable approach. It is something that is imbibed psychologically in the minds of anyone who wants to be a savior, anyone who thinks that they are superior to others, and thinks that it is only them who can bring betterment into the lives of others. So that's how we approached the topic and the book and all its contributions.
And you use it not in a racial kind of context, more in broader context.
Yes and no. I mean, it is definitely racial because we are specifically talking about white saviorism. So that is the idea of how the white industrialized Western world wants to save the non-Western
Mm.
marginalized world. So yes, absolutely, there is a racial element involved in it, no doubt. But it is also because we're talking about saviorism as a mindset. That means it can go beyond
Beyond.
that
Yes, yes.
as well. So it is a bit of both. It is definitely racial. It is also conceptual.
And when you were leading this book, this anthology project, you and your co-editors allowed academics, practitioners to share their opinions, experiences regarding this term, white saviorism. But you also made a conscious decision, only allow contributors and people to come and be part of this from the southern countries, southern writers. Why was this important criterion for you, Themrise?
Because for us, this was about not the North, it was about the South. They've always been on the receiving end of white saviorism. So we know what people have to say about it in the West. Not much. They think they're saviors. That's it. Who else is going to do it? But it's actually the recipients of that who have the real stories to tell because they have to face this every single day. And most publications focus a lot on authors from the North. They always get the opportunity to publish and write. Whereas people in the global South never do get those opportunities. And I know that from experience being based in the global South, I never got a chance to be published internationally because I just didn't have that profile being from the global South. So we wanted to give the opportunity to people from the global South, in particular people who had actually never published before or never actually written before, to give them the chance to say their piece and to have their voice heard. So this was a non-negotiable for us. We just wanted the opportunity to be for those who never get the opportunity.
Let's listen to reading from one of the chapters written by Sadaf Shalvani and Shama Dosa. It's entitled Evaluation and the White Gaze in International Development.
Evaluation, along with research and monitoring, is an important tool that perpetuates the white gaze in global development. According to Smith, 2012, research through imperial eyes, what we call the white gaze, centers on a Western worldview, conveys superiority and entitlement, and is driven by a desire to bring progress into the lives of indigenous peoples who are viewed as lacking. This approach steals knowledge from indigenous peoples, and its primary benefits are accrued by those who stole it.
Timri, when looking at this particular chapter and how international development, similarly global health, rely on ability to use evidence, to learn, to improve, and of course, some of it is very familiar to me, but yet this chapter sometimes may question some of the fundamental evaluation practices. And someone who works for a program that is focused on so much on implementation and research and results, I have to ask, how do you think we could find a better alternative way to know how we're making progress? I'm very convinced that many of our listeners are intrigued by this particular use of how this is interpreted.
This was actually a chapter that is extremely relevant to the sector as a whole and was one of our most read, I have to say, and I'm so glad we got an opportunity to talk about this. So this is another thing that's a very, very popular, let's say, subsector within international development as a whole. I myself have been an evaluator for about 10 years of my career. And the example I gave right in the beginning was that I was on an evaluation, quote unquote, mission with the international evaluators who had come in from North America, and I was the national evaluator. And everything was done by them. Like they brought the matrices, they brought the evaluation criteria with them. This is how it's going to be done. This is the information that we need. And this is how we need to put it together. And all that was predetermined, pre-decided. And we would sit and talk about it together as a team, no doubt. And I would give reams and reams of my own little reports about these visits and, the Pakistani perspective on it. And ultimately, it would never actually get into the final evaluation report. And that's also eventually what told me, well, they're not really interested to hear what we have to say. Everything has to be measured according to this preset criteria that comes from there.
Mm-hmm.
And that preset criteria doesn't actually match with the realities on the ground. Like I know we had, it's, the OECD DAC evaluation criteria of relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, sustainability, etc. That was the guiding principle. And we had to sort of force fit so many fantastic findings and nuances that we would come across during our visits into these 4 or 5 fixed criteria. And I'm like, this doesn't fit. You need a new criteria for this. No, we've got to fit it in somehow. And so then you think, well, what are the findings that would come out of this? What exactly is being evaluated? Who is doing it? And why? And there was tons of evidence that actually would be left untouched. And so there you go. I mean, when we constantly talk about evidence-based planning or evidence-based research, when the evidence, you have the flexibility to pick and choose it because you happen to be the one orchestrating the entire project, then is that really even evidence at all? And that's exactly the white gaze that Sadafin Sharma speak about. That, where is this coming from? This is coming from, the white Western world. This is not our evaluation criteria. This is not how we would want to evaluate our work.
So what I take from this is that we have to look beyond this set things that we use and question and look further and not miss other aspects of how the progress is made or how lives are improved.
Oh, 100%. In fact, I would go one step further and saying not just, change the processes, change who does the evaluation.
Right.
I mean, why can't we evaluate our own work? I've brought this up before, and people say, well, that's a conflict of interest. How can you evaluate your own work? I said, well, how can you evaluate work in a country you've never even been to and you know nothing about?
Interesting.
Then you're literally just ticking boxes. That is literally all you are doing. So it's not about, it's just evaluation needs to be in our control as well. And eventually it can become collaborative. Absolutely. I'm not saying kick everybody out, but for it to become collaborative, you've got to be open to collaboration. And I think the evaluation field is not at all open to collaboration. So we need to change the narrative as well in terms of who is the evaluator and who is the evaluated, and why is that so?
Switching to another chapter again, it is using another term. So here, the chapter is called Matriarchy Complex. Very interesting. Let's listen to a reading from this chapter.
While the white Western male has been the most visible representative of the white savior in international development as the face of the donor, implementer, and manager, his female counterpart has equally perpetuated racist stereotypes. She is the gender expert, specialist, or consultant who travels from the prosperous North to the underdeveloped South to design, manage, advise, or train Southern women and men on how to achieve success in gender equality. At a time when gender equality is now as much a topic of discussion in the North as it is in the South, she is also gradually taking over as the face of international development by representing international organizations in the Global South.
Themrise, here you characterize a white woman working in development as a matriarch, someone who sees her knowledge as superior or otherwise assumes positions of power that should be in hands of local women. How this phenomena came about and how is it perpetuated? I also want to see, is it possible to generalize to all white women?
So that chapter is very close to my heart, and I wrote it because of my interaction as a brown woman from the Global South with white women from the West in my own country, as well as in their country. And I use the term matriarch, which is actually a term that I discovered with the help of my co editors, that the women in colonial times, the wives of the British officers in Africa and South Asia, actually did. There's a lot of literature available, some of which I have also mentioned in the chapter. They considered themselves to be mothers to the natives because they thought that these poor natives needed to be looked after and nurtured, and that they were the ones to do it. So, hence the term matriarch, which I also use as a play on patriarchy, because that's all we talk about. But we never talk about the fact that women too are as much uh, part of this industry in perpetuating the inequalities of this industry as much as men are. And white women in particular, because they come with their male counterparts from the same countries. So they do look at us differently. I mean, I'll be very frank with you, there isn't much of a sisterhood going on between women from the global south and the global north. We may claim there is, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of tension because white women do come in as the power holders. And a lot of them treat young women very badly. And I used a lot of real life examples from women I spoke to and requested them about their lived experiences. And so, and coming back to your issue about is it only white women? No, it's not. I mean, they have started that issue of power. But another finding is that it is also just if a non white woman represents a powerful institution in the global north, she also imbues that matriarchy complex.
This is very good that you've unpacked this. I think it's a very uncomfortable conversation at times, but you were able in this book to unpack it and let people ask these questions. In part 2 of the book, you have real life experiences submitted to you from countries. And one anonymous chapter highlights the presence of brown saviors in countries. And you already touched upon that. And again, I'm quoting your book. I haven't come up with those terms. The story highlights the account of a mid-level Bangladeshi manager who would rather hire the son of the Bangladeshi ambassador, favoring political connections over technical expertise. This is not an uncommon phenomenon, obviously, but is it also perpetuating unfair privilege and power? And do you think we have any ways to stop this perpetuation of saviorism?
First thing that I always say is that unfair privilege and power exists everywhere. Everywhere. I think any country you go to, any institution you go to, any government you go to, any community you go to, any village you go to, there is privilege and power, right? So we see social hierarchies in villages between tribes, between feudals and the farmers who work on their lands, right? So it exists everywhere. I think that's something we all have to be very mindful of when we speak of privilege and power. Secondly, because this exists everywhere, it definitely exists in the global south. And in global south, the system of nepotism is very, very strong. And we see it everywhere. I see it in Pakistan every day. Right? In Pakistan, we call it sifarish. Sifarish is a word in Urdu which means, how do I translate it? It means a personal request, right? So somebody requests you,
favor.
Exactly. Sorry, favor. That's correct. So this is my son, and please give him a job, or please put in a good word for him, etc., etc. Right? It's embedded itself into our society so deeply that it's basically how societies run now. So how do you change that? How do you change that core? So it's a very, very difficult question. And what you need is somebody to just come and rip it to shreds and not be scared of the consequences and just start all over again. But who's going to do that, right? So it's hard, but it is an outcome of the privilege and power that it exists everywhere.
Right. Maybe the start is to talk about it, including this conversation we're having, and putting that out and hearing from you and all of your contributors to the work you've done. In the final part of our conversations, maybe we can look a bit more into future and strategies. In a recent report you published, you wrote that there is a need to completely move away from the current model of what we call aid and development towards independent nations meeting their own development needs and generating their own systems of financial technical support. And obviously, you're writing overall for development, and probably this applies to global health immediately the same way. Do you believe that this aid system can transform, or does it need a more radical approach?
Oh, I think it needs to be burnt to the ground. I think it needs to be completely destroyed, broken down, and then completely built up from scratch by someone else. And honestly, that is now I mean, I've thought about this for years. My first instinct was that let's separate the two, let the North and the South figure out their own problems first, and then we can come together, sit together at the table, and maybe discuss what needs to be done next. Um, and most people didn't agree with that because they're like, no, we just have to be collaborative. And I said, you can't be collaborative when countries themselves don't know where they stand internally. I'm not talking about internationally, but internally, where do they stand as a nation amongst their own people? So we aren't even having those conversations within different countries. You're asking a group of countries to sit together with another group of countries and work things out. Not going to happen. But then the more I delve into it, the more I seriously believe the system is damaged so much beyond repair. And we see that with Gaza, with Palestine. This has been an opportunity for the entire industry to actually change the way they work and to do something to prevent millions of people from being killed. But they have done absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And there was a study that I just saw a couple of days ago by this voluntary organization in the UK called Charity So White that did a study of the charities in the UK to see what their response to the Palestinian situation was. And I think, I'm not exactly sure of the number, but close to a little over 50% of the charities in the UK had remained absolutely silent about it. So when you have a system that is supposed to prevent inequalities, that's supposed to prevent conflict, that's supposed to quote unquote help people in distress, when more than half of them have remained deathly silent in one of the worst cases of conflict that we have seen in this century, then honestly, there is nothing you can do to transform the system. You literally have to burn it to the ground.
Themrise, as someone who works in this area, one of the things you always mentioned and comes through from your writing as well is this intersection of different aspects of human development. And it comes to health, it's not just health, it's also housing, income, education, etc. And obviously, we've seen how COVID played out, and you've mentioned that at the top of the conversation. You cautioned that global health often fails to account for many other related intersecting human rights or other issues. That holds rather a one sided view of society that doesn't really help in terms of how to deal with these issues. Maybe you could share your views on how you think this can be changed, especially with our looking forward, how we prevent future pandemics or how we tackle some major global health issues.
So for me, I have been what they call a generalist in this field, but I think it's strengthened my understanding of the sector as a whole much better than had I been somebody just working in the health sector or just in the education sector or just in, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And that is where I think we have really run short in the development sector as a whole, is that we compartmentalize everything in it. So health is an extremely important component for me of the overall idea of human development, right? If you don't have health, you're not able to be educated. You're not able to get a job. You're not able to, look after others if you have health issues. But in international development, when we look at health, my perception is that we're looking at basic health, right? We're looking at the access of every citizen in a country to be able to access health facilities and health services, right? So then there's the whole scientific aspect of health, right? The research, the development of drugs, the treatments, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a very specialized field. But in development, we're talking about just basic rights. And access to health is a basic right. But so is access to education, so is access to a living wage, so is access to shelter, so is access to water, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to look at all these components together as a whole if we want a community to survive. You can't just provide a community with health services and say you've done your job.
Right.
And I think COVID-19 brought this out very clearly in the sense that everybody started focusing so much on health. We didn't realize that we created an education emergency because children had to be out of school for months on end. And so they lost an opportunity to learn. People lost income because they didn't have jobs. And this is a health emergency that did that. So I think COVID-19 brought out these intersections very clearly. But I think the sector as a whole was too focused inwards. And that happens with all subsectors. But that, I think, is also something you need to keep in mind for future, not just pandemics, but any sort of a crisis that happens. Ultimately, it will be linked to all other components of an individual's life.
Themrise, as we end, I'd like to ask you to offer some guidance or hope for our listeners. And what can they actually do at individual level to contribute towards greater power equity in global health and in development?
I'm one of the worst persons to ask any question about hope or
Okay.
guidance because I am just terrible at it. It's not that I don't have hope. I'm just a very pessimistic person. But in my pessimism, there is a lot of optimism as well. So when I talk about things like, burn it all down, yes, that's a lot of people will say that's very negative. But behind that thinking is that burn it all down so we can rebuild properly again, right? So there's hope in that. At least I hope there is. And I think individually, it is very important for us to look at ourselves individually. I continue to evolve. Even though I've been in this field for 30 years, counting, I continue to evolve. My thinking continues to evolve based on everything that's happening around me. And I think that is something we need to harness into ourselves as individuals. We all keep saying, what can I just do in this massive world of inequality? It's true. You may not be able to do everything, but I think your own actions may speak a lot for a wider community. I left the sector as a consultant. I've stopped doing all the work that I used to do because I just don't believe it anymore. For me, that action is enough to convince me that as an individual, it may just be me, one person, but hopefully others will also follow suit eventually if it works for them. So I think that is something you keep questioning yourself. You have to keep questioning yourself and you have to look at the world through a wider lens. It can't just be yours. You've got to look beyond yourself as well. So I think I would end with that.
Thank you, Themrise, for this great conversation. It was great to talk to you and get this really different perspectives through this conversation.
Thank you very much, Garry. It was a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you so much.
As we, the global health community, wrestle with how to decolonize global health, Themrise's experiences in the broader international development sector could serve as helpful signposts. First, Themrise highlights the importance of language and how often it fails to give adequate expression of the experiences of people in different countries. Themrise confirms something I already knew. the fact that the term decolonization was not a term found in many other languages. Secondly, Themrise cautions the global health community to not be insular in trying to achieve greater power equity by reminding us that health is merely one aspect of human development and it needs to account for other intersecting issues. Thirdly, our current system is far from ideal, and this is an opportunity for each of us to practice greater humility. If history has taught us anything, there is no single group of experts who have all the answers for global health, neither in the North nor in the South. True systemic transformation of international development and global health will only be realized through greater humility and respectful collaboration. To learn more about the topic discussed in this episode, visit the episode's webpage, where you will find additional readings, show notes, and translations. Don't forget to get in touch with us via social media, email, or by sharing a voice message. And be sure to subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Global Health Matters is produced by TDR, a United Nations co-sponsored research program based at the World